So here's another positive argument for atheism. It's sort of so obvious that I hadn't thought I should introduce it, and I certainly didn't think I was going to have time. But this back and forth has gone on so long that I've got this last chance, and I'm going to use it. So why is it that God is a hypothesis that science has so little use for? You may recall when the king of France, Louis XIV, approached Laplace, the great 18th century physicist, and said, "But what is the role of God in your system?" The answer was, "I have no need of that hypothesis." And of course, the reason that science has no need of the hypothesis is that God makes no contribution to the predictive power of any part of any of the sciences. And for that reason, there's no basis on which to invoke God either for explanatory or any other purposes in science. And therefore, science has no more need for, and indeed a considerable reason to deny the existence of God than it has to accept the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus. The absence of a role for God in the predictive and explanatory content of science is, quite apart from the problem of evil, the principal reason why 95% of the members of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States are atheists, and why science can provide not only no good basis for theism, but an excellent argument against it. Indeed, if we think back to the invocation of Willard Van Orman Quine, the great American philosopher, by Professor Craig, you'll recall that he pointed out that Quine adopts abstract objects, the objects of mathematics, as existing even though they are abstract, even though they're not concrete, even though they're not physical items in the world. Why? Because they were indispensable to the predictive power of science. And because they were indispensable, Quine had no good argument against them and said that science not only had no good argument against them, but in fact it had a good argument for their existence because of the contribution they made to enabling us to predict detailed experiments, meter readings, right, of scientific experiments, which is the litmus test of reasonability among scientists. And to invoke the objects of mathematics as part of an argument for the existence of God fails to reflect this indispensable fact about the reasons that scientists are committed to them. If God could do as much for science as the number 2, physicists would be much more receptive to his existence.
Yes, Dr. Craig, I just want to know, how would you respond to Dr. Rosenberg's argument in his concluding statement that science can operate without having to account for God?
That science what?
That science can operate without having to account for God or taking account.
God makes no predictive contribution. God makes no predictive contribution.
Yeah, that's what I was
saying. I read his interview in the campus newspaper this morning, trying to get some clues to what he might say this evening, and saw this argument about predictability. And here's what my thoughts on this are. Predictability is just one way to test for the truth of a scientific theory. And it's not always useful. Some theories, for example, are empirically equivalent in their predictions. For example, I mentioned 10 different physical interpretations of quantum mechanics, which are all empirically equivalent. There are 3 different interpretations of special relativity, which are all empirically equivalent. And yet they're different theories, and each one is a legitimate scientific theory, even though they can't be assessed based on predictability. Other factors then can come into play, things like simplicity, plausibility, degree of ad hocness, explanatory power. These are other theoretical virtues besides predictability that we can use in testing a hypothesis. And predictability is especially difficult to apply when you're dealing with a free agent rather than with impersonal, mechanistic causes. in particular, in God's case, how could you predict what God would do? You could predict perhaps that if a universe exists, then it would be fine-tuned for our existence, or that if God created a universe, it would likely have objective moral values and duties. I think you could make that kind of prediction, but how could you predict as a free agent whether or not God would create a universe at all? So instead, I don't think what you do is look for predictability. You follow Quine's prescription. Remember, Quine said, if you could show the indirect explanatory benefit of positing things like a creator, then I would joyfully accord them scientific status along with these other entities like quarks and black holes. And so I would say that that theism has explanatory power to offer us. For example, fine-tuning is more probable on theism than on naturalism. States of intentionality are more probable on theism than on naturalism or atheism. Objective moral values and duties are more probable on theism than on naturalism. The resurrection of Jesus is more probable on theism than on naturalism. So in all of these ways, I think theism is an explanatorily beneficial hypothesis that explains a wide range of the data of human experience, which atheism cannot explain.